May 1945, Germany. The war in Europe was coming to an end, but no one felt it that way on the ground. The villages reeked of smoke and defeat. The roads were littered with rubble, silence, and people who no longer knew which way to walk. Corporal Jimmy Hayes had been in Europe for 8 months. He'd crossed the Atlantic as a farm boy from Iowa who'd never left his home state, and now, here he was, in the middle of a shattered continent, a rifle in his hand, and a war that was almost over, weighing on his soul. That morning, Hayes was guarding a checkpoint at the entrance to a small German town. It was a cold, gray morning, with that pale light European dawns have in spring. No one had passed by in hours, just the wind, the dust, and the silence. Then he saw her. A girl, maybe 7 years old, blonde braids, a dress far too big for her body, clearly handed down from someone older, shoes broken, holes worn through the toes. She walked alone from the direction of the village, straight toward the checkpoint, without hesitation, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. She planted herself in front of Hayes, looked at him, and without saying a single word, held out her hands, palms up. She didn't need English. She didn't need any language at all. That gesture is understood by any human being, anywhere in the world. Hayes looked at her. He looked past her, down the empty road, then glanced to the sides, and what he saw turned his stomach. Among the ruins of the nearby houses, in the broken corners and doorways, there were more children. 12, 24. Emerging slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether to come closer or run. All of them watching, all of them waiting. Hayes put his hand in his pocket. There it was, a Hershey bar, saved from the day before's ration. He'd been holding on to it, planning to eat it that night once his shift ended. A small reward for himself. But now it was in his hand, and there was a starving girl standing in front of him with her palms held out. Sergeant Mike Donovan had been watching the scene since the girl first approached. He moved, crossed the checkpoint, and stood beside Hayes. He put a hand on his shoulder. What Hayes did next was going to decide a lot of things. Not just for that girl, but for everyone watching. The report reached General Patton's desk that same afternoon. And what Patton did next, nobody expected. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Here we tell the stories of World War II that the textbooks leave out. The impossible decisions, the humanity behind the uniform. The town was called Kromberg, a small municipality in central Germany, the kind that never shows up on the big war maps. There'd been no decisive battle there. The front had simply rolled over it like a storm 2 weeks earlier. Most of the buildings were still standing. That was the good part. Everything else was the bad part. Germany was collapsing from the inside. Supply lines had been broken for weeks. Food trucks weren't arriving. The town's stores had been emptied by German soldiers before they withdrew. The markets didn't function. Money was worthless. People ate what they could find, or they didn't eat at all. The civilians of Kromberg had spent days living off whatever was left in their pantries. And the pantries were nearly bare. The hardest hit, as always, were the most vulnerable. The elderly, women alone, and children. The Americans had set up the checkpoint at the town's main entrance 3 days earlier. Their mission was clear: control the movement of people and vehicles. No distributing supplies, no interaction with civilians beyond what was strictly necessary. Standard occupation procedure. Corporal Jimmy Hayes was 23. He was the second of 3 children in an Iowa farming family. He'd grown up among cornfields, endless summers, and the kind of quiet stillness that only exists out in the country. He'd enlisted at 22, pushed by the same silent patriotism that sent thousands of American boys across the ocean without really knowing what waited for them on the other side. 8 months in Europe had changed him. He'd seen real combat in France and in Belgium. He'd lost 2 men from his platoon. He'd learned what real fear felt like. The kind that doesn't scream, but settles into your chest and never leaves. But he hadn't hardened completely. He could still feel things. And in that moment, that was the most important thing about him. Sergeant Mike Donovan was an entirely different kind of man. 35 years old, a career soldier. He'd fought in the Pacific before being sent to Europe. He'd lived through 2 wars and buried more friends than he could count. He knew the rules better than anyone, and he respected them, not out of fear, but out of conviction. For Donovan, the rules were the only thing separating a disciplined army from an armed mob. That morning, the 2 men were on duty together at that dusty checkpoint, and neither of them knew that what was about to happen would mark them both for the rest of their lives. It all began when the girl appeared. She came from the direction of the village, alone, walking down the middle of the road as if she had no energy left to dodge the potholes. Hayes saw her from a distance and followed her with his eyes without moving. A small, thin girl. The kind of thinness that isn't natural in a child. The kind that comes from weeks of not eating properly. When she reached him and held out her hands, Hayes felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was something deeper. It was recognition. It was the instant certainty that standing in front of him was a human being who needed help, and that he had the power to give it. Donovan stepped in before Hayes could react. "Hayes, back off." "Sarge, look at her." "I'm looking. I see a German civilian. Feeding German civilians isn't our responsibility. It's not our job. She's starving. A lot of people are starving. That's what happens when you start a war and lose it." Hayes gripped the chocolate bar in his pocket. It was so small, so insignificant. He wasn't even that hungry himself. A simple piece of chocolate wasn't going to ruin anything or hurt anyone. Donovan saw the movement. He grabbed Hayes's wrist. "Don't." "Why not?" "Because if you give her that chocolate bar, you know what happens? Tomorrow every kid in that town shows up here. And then what? Are you going to feed 3,000 people with your rations? You got enough for that?" Hayes hesitated. He looked back at the girl. She was still there. She hadn't retreated a single inch. She just waited, with that exhausting patience children have when they've spent far too long waiting for things. And then Hayes looked past her and saw she was no longer alone. Behind the braided girl, more had been appearing. They emerged from the ruined buildings, from the alleys, from the dark doorways. They came slowly, without running, as if their bodies had nothing more to give. In under 5 minutes, about 30 children had formed a ragged group behind the first girl. Ages between 5 and 14. All thin, all dirty, all carrying that particular look people get after too much time spent hungry. A look that mixes hope and resignation in equal parts. They didn't push. They didn't shout. They didn't demand anything. They just stood there, waiting. One of the older ones, a boy of about 12, stepped forward. He spoke a little English. "Enough. Please, sir, we are hungry. Do you have food?" Donovan answered before Hayes could open his mouth. "There's no food for you. Go back to the village. The children are very hungry. Not our problem. Move along." The boy didn't move. He stood there, looking at Donovan with a mix of dignity and desperation that was hard to hold eye contact with. The smaller children behind him started shifting nervously. A girl of about 6 began to cry. Not loudly. She cried in silence, tears sliding down dirty cheeks because she didn't have the strength left to cry any other way. Something broke inside Hayes. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't stay still with food in his pocket while a 6-year-old girl cried from hunger 2 feet in front of him. He couldn't do it and still be the person he believed himself to be. He pulled the chocolate bar from his pocket and raised it. Every child's eyes locked onto it at once, like magnets, as if that small rectangle of chocolate were the most important thing in the world. And in that moment, For them, it was. Donovan grabbed his arm. Hayes, I'm ordering you. Don't give her that chocolate bar. Sarge, it's just a chocolate bar. It's not about the chocolate bar. It's about the principle. We feed our men, not the enemy. They're not the enemy. They're children. They're German children. Their fathers killed our men. Their mothers backed Hitler. Don't forget that. Hayes looked at the first girl, the one with the braids. She still had her palms out. She'd held that pose since the very beginning, arms never lowering, with that quiet determination only found in people who have nothing left to lose. She backed Hitler, Sarge? She voted for him? She started this war. Donovan's face hardened. No, but her country did. And that's the reality. War doesn't understand fairness. Hayes stood frozen, caught between two equally valid, completely opposing truths. He wanted to do the right thing, but he no longer knew, with any clarity, what the right thing was. The situation was starting to draw attention. Other soldiers from the post had gathered around. Some looked at the children with the same discomfort Hayes felt. Others nodded along with Donovan. No one said a word. Everyone waited to see what would happen. Donovan made a call. This was above his pay grade. He sent for the lieutenant. Lieutenant Parker arrived within 3 minutes. He was young, only a few years older than Hayes, with that air of someone still learning to carry the weight of command. He looked at the children, looked at his men, looked at Donovan. What have we got, Sergeant? German civilians asking for food, sir. I've denied the request. I need a clear order. Parker knew the regulations. Soldiers eat first. Civilians aren't the Army's responsibility in an occupation zone. Relief organizations exist for that. Rules were rules. Hayes saw it on the lieutenant's face. He watched him process the situation, search for the cleanest way out, the one that wouldn't compromise anyone. And he knew what Parker was going to say before he said it. And in that moment, Hayes made his own decision. He pulled his arm free from Donovan's grip, unwrapped the chocolate bar, and walked toward the children. Donovan didn't stop him this time. He just watched. Hayes knelt in front of the first girl, the one with the braids, and broke off a piece of chocolate. She took it with 2 fingers, with an almost ceremonial care, as if it were something sacred. She put it in her mouth and closed her eyes. The other children came forward. Hayes went down the line handing out pieces, but it was just 1 chocolate bar. 30 children. The fragments were tiny. Most got nothing at all. Those who received something broke it again and shared it with the smaller kids, spontaneously, without anyone asking them to. They understood scarcity. They carried it inside them. Within seconds, the chocolate was gone. The children looked at Hayes, waiting for more. He turned his pockets inside out to show them they were empty. The children understood. They didn't get angry. They didn't protest. They simply turned around and started walking back to the village, slowly, disappointed, but without resentment. The girl with the braids was the last to leave. She paused for a moment before turning the corner and looked back at Hayes over her shoulder. Just for a second. Then she kept walking. Hayes felt empty. He'd done something, but it felt like he'd done nothing at all. Lieutenant Parker walked over. Corporal, you just disobeyed a direct order. Yes, sir. You know that's grounds for a court-martial. Yes, sir. Parker looked at him for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. I'm going to write up the report and send it up the chain. Let the people above decide. Until then, you're confined to camp. Understood? Yes, sir. The report climbed the chain of command, from platoon to company, from company to division. And it finally landed on the desk of General George S. Patton's command trailer. Patton read it that afternoon. Read it once, read it twice. A corporal had disobeyed direct orders to give chocolate to starving German children. The lieutenant wanted to know how to proceed, whether to enforce discipline or let the matter go. Patton sat for a while with the report in his hand, staring out the window of the trailer. Outside, the German landscape stretched out in muted grays and greens. The war in Europe was practically over, but the consequences of that war, those were going to last decades. This wasn't a simple question. It was a question about what kind of army they were, what kind of men they wanted to be once all this was over, what they were going to leave behind in this broken country. He picked up the phone and called the division commander. "I'm coming over. Don't do anything until I get there." The next morning, Patton's jeep rolled into Kromberg at first light. He went straight to the checkpoint where Hayes had been stationed. The children were already there, more of them than the day before. Maybe 50. Word had spread through the village overnight. The Americans had handed out chocolate. Maybe today there'd be more. Maybe there'd be something to eat. Patton stepped out of the jeep. He stood in front of the group of children. They looked at him, not knowing who he was. To them, he was just another American officer, a man with a lot of stars on his uniform and an expression that was hard to read. Patton studied their faces, one by one, then turned to Parker. "Show me the corporal." Hayes was brought forward. He snapped to attention. He was terrified. Everyone knew Patton's reputation. He didn't tolerate insubordination. He didn't tolerate weakness. This was the general who had slapped a soldier in a hospital for crying. He wasn't the kind of man who forgave disobeyed orders. Patton looked him up and down in silence for several seconds. "You handed out your ration to enemy civilians." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Hayes thought about his answer. He decided not to dance around it. "Because they were hungry, sir, and because they were just children. Just children." "You know what children turn into, Corporal?" "Adults, sir. German adults. The same ones who might be fighting us in the next war. History repeats. Wars come back around." Hayes didn't know how to answer that. It was true. It was an ugly, real truth. Europe's history over the past 50 years had proven it in blood. Patton turned to Parker. "What's your recommendation, Lieutenant?" "Sir, I believe discipline is necessary. If we allow soldiers to make individual decisions about ration distribution, we'll have chaos. The regulations exist for a reason." Patton nodded slowly, then turned and looked at the children again. They were still there, in that patient, exhausted silence that's hard for anyone with a shred of humanity to ignore. He walked toward them. The children instinctively took a step back. This man was different. He radiated something they couldn't name but recognized. Authority, power, something dangerous. Patton crouched down to the level of the nearest child. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a standard-issue chocolate bar from his own ration. He held it out to the girl with the braids standing right in front of him. She took it, looked at the chocolate, looked at Patton, looked back at the chocolate. Patton stood up and turned to his staff. "Get me the supply officer." A major appeared within seconds. "Sir?" "How much food do we have in this area?" "Ample reserves, sir. Enough for 2 months at the current rate." "Good. I want a distribution point set up right here, twice a day. We're going to feed these civilians. Not large quantities, just enough that they don't starve." The major hesitated for a second. "Sir, regulations state that—" "I know exactly what regulations state. I'm changing them for this sector. We feed non-combatants, especially children. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Patton turned back to Parker and Hayes. Both men were watching him without blinking. "Lieutenant, you were right about discipline. Soldiers can't act on their own individual judgment. That leads to chaos, and chaos in an occupation zone is dangerous." He paused. "Corporal, you were right about humanity. We can't stand around with our arms crossed while children starve 2 feet in front of us. We didn't come all this way for that." He looked at both men. "Here's the new order. Food doesn't get handed out individually and at random. That creates disorder. But no one starves either. Not the children, not the elderly, not anyone who hasn't raised a weapon against us. We're going to set up an organized, fair, consistent distribution system. Every child gets something, every day, until the relief organizations arrive. He turned specifically to Hayes. Your heart was in the right place, but you can't save the world with a single chocolate bar. To really help people, you need a system, organization, consistency. That's what makes the difference. Hayes nodded. Yes, sir. Patton made as if to leave, then stopped. He turned back one last time. Corporal, you're not facing a court-martial. You're being reassigned. As of today, you're in charge of the civilian relief program in this sector. I want those children eating every day. No excuses. Hayes stood frozen, stunned. Yes, sir. Patton climbed into the jeep. Before it pulled away, he said one last thing, quietly, almost to himself. We didn't fight this war to become them. Don't forget that. The jeep disappeared down the road. For the next 3 weeks, until the relief organizations arrived, Hayes ran the distribution point in Kromberg. Every morning at 6, every evening at 6. Rain or shine. With a team of volunteers that grew larger each day, Hayes set up the tables in the village square. Soup, bread, milk for the youngest ones. Simple rations, but consistent. Predictable. The children quickly learned the system. By 5:30, there was already a line. Orderly, patient. They knew there'd be enough for everyone. Something deep in their faces began to change. The girl with the braids came every day, always near the front of the line, never pushing, just arriving early and waiting. Hayes learned her name the second week. Anna. She lived with her grandmother, an elderly woman who could barely walk. Her father had died in Russia in '43. Her mother had been killed in an air raid the year before. Anna was 7 years old, living alone with an old woman in a shattered country. After the first week, Anna started smiling when Hayes served her ration. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible. But Hayes noticed it. He noticed, too, that her cheeks were starting to fill out a little, that the extreme paleness of those first days was fading, that she was becoming a child again. By the end of the second week, something changed. Anna arrived at the morning distribution with something in her hand, a piece of paper folded carefully. When she reached the front of the line and he handed her the ration, she offered him the paper. Then she turned and ran off, shy, not waiting to see his reaction. Hayes unfolded the paper. It was a pencil drawing. An American soldier, corporal's stripes on his uniform, handing bread to a girl with braids. The soldier's features were drawn with that careful precision children use when they draw something that matters to them. Every detail remembered, every line drawn with intention. Anna couldn't write in English. She didn't know the letters, but she'd found a way to say what she needed to say. Hayes folded the drawing and tucked it into his breast pocket, close to his heart. He carried it with him for the rest of his service, through France, through Germany, on the ship back home. When he reached Iowa, he framed it. He hung it on the living room wall of the house where he'd spend the rest of his life. Decades later, his grandson noticed it. He was a curious kid, the kind who asks questions about everything. Grandpa, why do you have a drawing of a kid hanging on the wall? Hayes looked at it for a moment, then looked at the drawing. Because that drawing reminds me of the day I understood what we'd really been fighting for. The grandson waited for more explanation. Hayes didn't give one. He just stood there, looking at the drawing in silence, with that expression old men get when they remember things the young still can't understand. Patton never mentioned the incident again. To him, it was just one more decision among the thousands he made during the war. A problem identified, a system implemented, a result achieved. That's how his mind worked. But for the 20 soldiers who were at that checkpoint that day in May, it was something else entirely. It was the moment they understood that winning a war didn't just mean defeating an enemy. It meant deciding who you were going to be once the guns stopped firing. It meant choosing. In the moments when no one was forcing you to choose anything, whether you were going to hold on to some piece of your humanity or leave it behind in some ditch in Europe. Hayes chose to hold on to his, and a girl named Anna, with blonde braids and broken shoes, drew him a picture of a soldier handing bread to a little girl. And that was enough. What would you have done? Would you have given the children the food or followed orders? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, about the hardest decisions of World War II and the humanity behind the uniforms, subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's a new story waiting for you.